The garbage truck rolled past Donald Harding's home for the second week in a row, and this time, he didn't just watch. From the porch, Donald's eyes followed the vehicle as it rumbled down Dogwood Lane, its back end groaning and emptying the neighbor's bins with mechanical precision, then veering past his without even a slowdown. He didn't wave. He didn't curse. He simply took a sip from his ceramic mug, the one with retired, not rusted, etched in fading navy blue, and gave a low whistle. Glenn came jogging up moments later, sweat darkening the collar of his t-shirt. His steps slowed as he noticed the untouched garbage still neatly lined up by the curb. Again? He asked, panting lightly. Donald glanced toward the bin as if it had spoken. Same as last Tuesday. They stood in quiet for a beat, save for the distant hum of cicadas and the occasional bark from Moose, their aging Labrador who now mostly barked at nothing and slept like it paid well. Glenn reached down to scratch the dog behind the ears, then walked to the bin and lifted the lid, more out of habit than hope. The plastic bags inside were intact and starting to sweat in the late August heat. Maybe they missed the address. Glenn offered. Donald shook his head. 2 weeks in a row's a pattern. Not a fluke. Back inside, Glenn checked the neighborhood online board from his phone. A recent post, buried under bake sale announcements and pest control offers, caught his eye. HOA notice, curb compliance review, non-compliant addresses may be reviewed for suspended services until further notice. The wording was vague enough to be infuriating. He read it aloud. Donald only raised an eyebrow. They start throwing around compliance like it's confetti, you know someone's up to something. Want me to call the waste company? No need, Donald said, rising slowly from his rocker. We've got the neighborhood coffee thing this morning. Better we ask in person. They walked the few blocks to Dottie's Diner, a squat brick building with sun-bleached awnings and iced tea that could revive a ghost. The door's tiny bell chimed as they entered, and a wave of voices and the smell of fried eggs greeted them like an old sweater. Morning, Louise, Donald nodded at the server behind the counter, who wore her hair piled high and had a memory like a vault. Your booth's open, she said without being asked. They took their usual spot by the window. Glenn glanced around. Most of the regulars were there, Harold from the post office, the Millers from Maple Street, and a few younger families still figuring out the rhythm of the neighborhood. Then there was Trish. She sat at the far corner, notebook open, glasses perched low on her nose. Her SUV was visible through the window, parked at a perfect 45-degree angle. She spotted them and stood with a smile that seemed pressed from plastic. Morning, gentlemen, she said, sliding into their booth without invitation. Trish, Donald said politely, setting down his mug. She clasped her hands together like a teacher about to deliver a lesson. Hope your week's starting out all right. I noticed your bin was still out front. Glenn didn't hide his irritation. That's because it hasn't been picked up in 2 weeks. Any idea why? Trish tilted her head. Oh, well, as you may be seen, we're undergoing a bit of a compliance audit. Nothing personal. Just making sure everyone meets the new curbside placement guidelines. You know, uniformity. Donald blinked. Glenn blinked twice. Uniformity, Glenn echoed. Is that in the bylaws? Trish smiled again, this time with the faintest glint of condescension. Compliance is a shared responsibility, dear. Donald stirred his coffee and looked at her over the rim of his mug. Well, that's interesting. Let's document that. She hesitated for a moment, then rose with the same composed stiffness she'd entered with. If you have any questions, the HOA's always open for feedback. Then, as if it were scripted, she added, have a blessed day, and returned to her corner. Blessed, Donald repeated quietly, finishing his coffee. Well, bless her heart. Back home, Glenn pulled Moose's water bowl from the porch, filling it from the garden spout. Donald stood with arms crossed, looking down the street. The breeze had picked up just enough to carry the scent of neglected garbage. Tren duong vi, ong nin Glen va noi, nu ko I gi toi siem lang, ko I chua tung thay toi len ban vi luke 3 geo sang. The trick, Donald said, is knowing where they hide the fine print. His voice echoed slightly in the garage, bouncing off dusty blueprints and the slow whir of a floor fan that hadn't been oiled in years. Glenn stood near the folding table, arms crossed, watching as his father sorted through a plastic bin labeled HOA Docs Plus Miscellaneous, in neat, slanted handwriting. Beside it sat a weathered Epson dot matrix printer, cords coiled like garden snakes, long since retired but somehow still revered. The night air outside was humid and still, punctuated only by the steady drone of crickets and the faint metallic clink from a neighbor dragging out recycling bins. Moose dozed under the workbench, legs twitching in a dream or maybe reacting to the faint scent of something forgotten under a tarp. Glenn leaned over. "You really kept all this?" Donald didn't look up. "It's not hoarding if it's organized." Debatable. They'd spent the better part of the evening sifting through HOA newsletters, copied agendas, and past waste management invoices. At first glance, everything looked standard, until Glenn pulled out a copy of the garbage collection agreement from the previous year. Donald took the sheet and held it to the bare bulb above them, tracing a finger down to the bottom. "There," he said, tapping lightly. "Updated to reflect committee approval." "Which committee?" Glenn squinted. "There's no signature. No meeting notes. No vote." Donald nodded. "And yet, they enacted it." Across the street, a silhouette moved up a ladder, securing a fresh banner to the light pole near the community board. "Clean street, clear mind," it read in block letters. "Troy?" Glenn asked. Donald peeked out the side window. "Looks like it. Kid's probably just doing what his mom tells him." Glenn pulled out his phone. "We need someone who knows how these budgets are supposed to look. Someone outside the HOA." Donald set his mug down with a clink. "Beverly. Didn't Trish say she was too old to understand digital forms? That's exactly why she's the right person." It took 2 knocks and a "Donald Harding, is that you?" before Beverly Cruz swung open her door, wrapped in a faded peach cardigan, floral tea mug in hand. Her house smelled like dried mint and cinnamon soap. "Well, I'll be," she said, stepping back to let them in. "Let me guess. Trish finally pushed one button too many." Donald handed her the folded contract. Beverly pulled out reading glasses from a crocheted case and sat at her kitchen table, her sharp eyes scanning faster than Glenn expected. It wasn't long before she gave a dry chuckle. "There it is," she said, pointing. "Exceptional cases subject to HOA discretion. That's what you're worried about." "Seems vague," Glenn offered. "It's not vague. It's illegal." Beverly underlined the phrase with her finger. "Discretion like this needs a vote. No exceptions. It's how cities get sued." Donald smiled faintly. "Mind giving that to me in writing?" Beverly stood, fetched a yellow pad, and began jotting. "Might as well start now. You two keep talking while I warm the kettle." Glenn wandered to the fridge, eyes drifting over a pinned article titled Sweet Bay's First Women's Treasurer, 1985. Beverly had once balanced an entire city budget. Now, she kept her books in graphite pencil and tracked grocery coupons like they were precious metal. They regrouped in the garage. Glenn laid out flyers he'd saved from the bulletin board, one claiming garbage compliance requirements, another praising the HOA for securing superior sanitation services. None of them bore official signatures. Donald reached for a stapled packet near the bottom of the bin. "Here, payment request forms. Monthly summaries." He flipped through them until one page stopped him cold. "Here," he said, handing it to Glenn. "Maintenance allocation, $1,200 to shed repairs," Glenn read aloud. "Purpose, Sanitation Committee Headquarters." Donald gave a low whistle. "That's the old tool shed behind Trish's house," Glenn said. "You think?" "She built herself an office," Beverly said from the doorway, holding 2 mugs of chamomile tea. "Without telling anyone." Donald rubbed his chin. "Not just an office. A fortress." They stood there in silence for a moment, letting the pieces settle into place like snowflakes on a windshield. Beverly took a slow sip of tea and said, almost too calmly, Donald, if you want to bury her, I suggest we start with receipts. By week 3, the flies were louder than the excuses, and Glenn had had enough. The buzzing around their trash bin had turned into a low, constant hum, like a warning sign from nature itself. Glenn stood on the front lawn, swatting aimlessly at the air with a rolled-up catalog, eyeing the small black cloud gathering over the garbage bags. Moose lifted his head, gave a single bark, then flopped back down with a grunt of indifference. "You're not helping," Glenn muttered to the dog. Donald stepped out with a glass of iced tea, clinking faintly with lemon slices. "You know," he said, "when I was on the Water Commission, we had a saying, if it smells bad, someone upstream's lying." On the bulletin board at the entrance of the subdivision, a laminated sheet had been freshly stapled. Glenn had walked past it earlier during his morning jog. At the top, in bold caps, non-compliant homes, updated list. The list was short. 3 names. Donald Harding was first. "Apparently," Donald said dryly, "we're now considered a sanitation threat." Glenn didn't laugh. He pulled out his phone and opened a folder labeled Trashgate. Inside were photos, email threads, and screenshots of HOA posts. He'd also fired off an email to their waste management contractor, asking why service was selectively suspended. No response yet. Later that afternoon, they walked down to the mini park by the lake, the unofficial gathering spot of Sweet Bay Falls. Picnic tables rested under a willow tree, and a small bulletin board stood crooked on its post, fluttering with aging notices. Trish was already there, speaking in hushed tones with a few residents. Her sunglasses were perched high, her ponytail tight as ever. She held a clipboard in one hand and a Starbucks cup in the other. Troy Moffat stood awkwardly beside her, taping up a new banner between 2 trees. "Clean Street, Clear Mind," it read, printed in forest green. Glenn locked eyes with him. Troy looked away. The wind shifted. Something sour drifted past. Glenn sighed. Back at the house, while Donald was reordering old digital files by year, Glenn heard a knock on the side gate. It was Troy, holding a manila envelope. "I'm not supposed to show you this," Troy said, glancing around. "But I think she's gone too far." Inside was a photocopy of the amended sanitation agreement, the one Trish had filed as HOA president. A small scribbled initial near the margin read TM, unmistakably hers. Glenn studied it for a long moment. "Thanks, Troy." That night, Glenn opened his laptop and launched sweetbayspeakup.net, a barebones site meant to collect neighbor comments, but now transformed into a hub of quiet defiance. He added a new post titled, "Selective Collection, Legal or Just Convenient?" The next day, Corey and Mina knocked on the door. The young couple had moved in last fall, barely out of grad school, always polite, always quiet. "We just thought you should know," Corey said, holding a small folder. "We got a warning last week for using the wrong color recycling bin. It's the same one we've always used. And it was left inside our screen door," Mina added, like a message. Donald took the folder and flipped through the printed warning. Same font. Same fake seal. "She's escalating," Glenn said. "Time we do the same." He walked with purpose to the neighborhood bulletin board, the list of non-compliant homes still flapping slightly in the breeze. He pulled a paper from his folder, unfolded it, and pinned it directly over the list. In bold letters, "Revised without vote, HOA legal." People began to gather, Corey, Mina, even old Mr. Jenkins, who usually never left his porch after 3 p.m. Trish marched up moments later, sunglasses now pushed onto her head, eyes sharp. She looked at the sign, then at Glenn. "You can't just post unfounded claims," she snapped. "I'll have you fined for defamation." Donald stepped forward, calm as always. "You'll have to stand in line, dear." On the morning of Sweet Bay's Labor Day barbecue, the air was thick with smoke, and not just from the grills. Donald adjusted the cuffs on his star-spangled button-up shirt, flipping hot dogs with slow precision while Glenn moved back and forth between tables, making sure every guest had iced tea, paper plates, and a shady spot to sit. From the center of the communal lawn, beneath a homemade banner that read, Sweet Bay Annual Barbecue. Laughter and the scent of charcoal drifted upward, but not without interruption. A sour stench clung to the breeze. A trash pile down by the lake path had doubled overnight, with bins overflowing and stray napkins fluttering through the hedges. Families had gathered as usual, but the irritation hung just beneath the surface, like flies circling a too-sweet pie. "I thought today was trash pickup," someone muttered near the lemonade stand. "It was," replied another. "Just not for all of us." Trish stood near a foldable table, arms crossed, sunglasses perched high like always. A clear plastic tub labeled, "For the Community, Ice Donations Welcome," sat beside her, filled with half-melted cubes and exactly one bottle of lukewarm sparkling water. Her smile was tight. She spotted Donald and made a beeline across the lawn. "Looks like someone forgot to bag properly last week," she said sweetly, her voice projecting. "That might explain the situation by the lake." Glenn looked up from the grill. "Our bags were double-knotted." "Same as always." Trish's smile didn't waver. "Sometimes it's not just about intention. It's about setting an example." Donald placed the tongs down carefully. "If you're referring to us, you might want to double-check the bylaws. And perhaps your math." Before Trish could answer, Beverly appeared at his side, holding a folder with the confident air of someone who'd balanced a city's books longer than Trish had owned a clipboard. "These are the original invoices for sanitation services from 6 months ago," Beverly said, handing one to Glenn. "And here are the versions Trish shared with the community." She held up a second sheet. Even at a glance, the numbers didn't match. "Those are outdated," Trish snapped. "Odd," Beverly mused. "Because they're dated 2 weeks apart. And yours show line items that don't appear on the originals." A murmur rippled through the guests. Corey and Mina stepped forward hesitantly, their baby monitor still clipped to Mina's hip. "We didn't want to stir things up," Corey said, "but Trish asked us to pay a $25 bin compliance fee in cash. Said it was for the HOA fund." "No receipts," Mina added. Trish waved a hand. "That's standard across." "It's not," said Harold Dennings, who had up to this point been quietly flipping through a local newsletter under a maple tree. "I did logistics for 30 years in the Army. This is manipulation. You don't enforce compliance with invisible rules." Trish flushed. "I don't have to take this." "But we do," Donald said, voice steady. Harold stood beside him. "I move that we ask for financial transparency. Today." The crowd quieted. Then someone clapped. Then another. It was Corey. Then Mina. Then Louise from Dottie's. Then Harold raised his voice, clear and calm. "Madam Chair, we request a full accounting. Publicly." Trish's mouth opened and closed. She looked down at the half-eaten cookie on her plate, as if searching for an escape route among the crumbs. She didn't find one. Without a word, she turned on her heel, leaving her Tupperware of blueberry bars behind on the folding table. Her shoes clicked louder than the music as she crossed the lawn. The folder was thick, the tabs color-coded, and the last one was labeled, Moffat, Audio plus Transfer Logs. The garage had been transformed. Once just a space for old fishing rods and folding chairs, now it looked like something between a campaign headquarters and a courtroom war room. A corkboard leaned against the back wall with colored string trailing between printouts, screenshots, and yellow sticky notes. A pot of coffee steamed beside an open laptop, where Glenn clicked through documents with the meticulous focus of someone born for this exact sort of organized rebellion. Donald sat at the workbench, flipping through a manila envelope while Beverly poured mint tea into mugs lined up beside a stapler. Outside, a storm cloud threatened, but inside, the calm was unnerving. "She filed a revision," Beverly said, tapping one of the sheets. "But there's no record of any vote. Not in the minutes, not even in the email chain she sends out to the committee." "She probably thought no one would look twice," Glenn murmured. "Or thought we were too old," Beverly added, smirking behind her mug. Glenn adjusted his glasses and opened a folder titled Trashgate_HOA_meeting_audio. He scrubbed forward through a recorded Zoom call, static crackled, then Trish's voice cut through, crisp and unmistakable. "They'll beg me for order." He paused the video. Silence followed, heavy and cold. Donald didn't say a word. He just reached for a pen, blue ink, as always, and underlined a time stamp on a notepad. The same kind he used years ago, back when his days were full of schematics and city planning documents. The side door creaked open. Troy stepped in, hair mussed, expression uneasy. He carried a flash drive and a brown folder, clutched like it might bite. "My mom doesn't know I have this," he said, handing it to Glenn. "She kept everything. She's been paranoid for months." Beverly opened the folder and pulled out a printed ledger, full of entries labeled things like community donation and security fee. One line read simply, Venmo_processing_03, next to a $200 transfer. "Unaccounted," she said. "All of it." Troy leaned against the wall, eyes downcast. "She didn't start this way. At first, she just wanted to fix sidewalks. Now she thinks she's running a kingdom." From her chair, Beverly picked up another sheet, a photocopy of an authorization form. "This signature isn't hers," she said, pointing to the swooping initials. "She forged a member's name." Glenn nodded. "That's criminal." "She's my mom," Troy said. "But I won't cover for her. Not anymore." A knock came from the garage door. Cindy, silver hair tucked under a ball cap that read "Mail Matters," stepped in with a tote bag. "You wanted stories about envelopes?" she said. "I deliver, I remember, She sat down and rifled through her bag. 3 plain white ones. No return address. Stiff. Slid into Trish's mailbox 2 days before each trash fee notice. Didn't think much of it until now." Beverly handed her a blank statement. "Would you be willing to put that in writing?" "Gladly," Cindy said. "People forget, postal folks notice everything." Glenn leaned back, exhaling slowly. "This is enough." Donald looked up from his pad. "Not yet." They spent the next hour assembling the presentation, audio clips, scanned receipts, copies of messages from residents, and payment logs. Beverly handled the formatting, Glenn trimmed video segments, Donald reviewed the timeline. They printed a cover sheet. Beverly titled the file, Sweet Bay HOA, Irregularities Report. Glenn looked at the wall of evidence, the charts, the maps, the emails. He ran a hand through his hair, exhausted but steady. "We don't attack," he said, more to himself than anyone. "We illuminate." The air in the garage was still. No shouting. No slammed fists. Just the quiet buzz of truth being put into order. Beverly said, "Donald, this is enough to shut her down." "Donald, no. It's enough to show who she's always been." There were 2 trays of cookies, 4 jugs of iced tea, and 25 angry citizens waiting for answers. The town's community room had been a polling station, a knitting club venue, and once even hosted a traveling puppet show, but tonight, it resembled a courtroom without a bench. Rows of plastic chairs stretched wall to wall, creaking under the weight of neighbors with crossed arms and narrowed eyes. Someone had written, "Special HOA Session, Open Floor," on the whiteboard in red dry erase marker. Below it, no yelling. No phones. No excuses. Donald sat near the front, spine straight, folder on his lap. Glenn stood beside the laptop they'd connected to the wall-mounted projector. Beverly paced near the coffee urn, watching the clock like it owed her something. Trish arrived 15 minutes late, wearing a purple dress that once declared authority but now seemed more like a costume from a past life. Her hair was hastily pinned. She didn't greet anyone. Troy trailed behind, face unreadable. Beverly leaned toward Glenn and whispered, "Never trust a meeting that skips the vote and serves sugar-free snacks." At 6:34 p.m., Donald stood. "I want to be clear," he began, voice calm. "This is not about revenge. This is about rules. And the people who think they're above them. He nodded to Glenn, who clicked a key. The projector flickered to life, casting Trish's recorded Zoom words into the still air. Cancel Harding. He's a problem. Gasps weren't dramatic, they were quiet, staggered, like tiny cracks forming across glass. Trish shifted in her seat. Beverly stepped forward, a folder tucked under her arm. Here is a summary of questionable expenditures drawn from HOA funds over the last 6 months. Line items include a $300 wireless router installed in a private attic, $500 for beautification with no invoices, and several cash withdrawals labeled as discretionary. She placed copies on a side table. Additionally, she said, holding up a page, this meeting's contract revision was filed under a name that does not belong to any board member. The signature was forged. Trish opened her mouth, but Troy beat her to it. He walked to the center slowly, rubbing his palms together. My mother did things she wasn't authorized to do, he said. I don't know how it got this far. But I won't defend it anymore. His voice was small, but it filled the space. From the third row, a silver-haired man in suspenders stood up. I gave $42 for HOA-funded lighting on the front gate, he said, voice steady. That gate's been dark for 4 months. More murmurs. A woman raised her hand, then stood without waiting. What about the security camera fees? Donald waited until it quieted again. Then he opened his folder and said, we have documents, recordings, witness statements. The question is whether we accept this as standard, or decide that Sweet Bay Falls deserves better. Silence. Then someone in the back said, I move to vote. No one objected. A simple show of hands was all it took. First Beverly's, then Corey and Mina, then nearly everyone. Even those who'd once defended Trish raised their hands without looking at her. The vote wasn't just unanimous. It was solemn. Trish's mouth trembled. She stood, but her knees seemed to resist. She pointed at Donald, fingers unsteady. You'll regret this. Donald didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He simply handed a sealed folder to the city liaison seated near the front, calm, deliberate, and final. The garbage trucks returned that Monday, but this time, they skipped only one house, Trish Moffat's. The rumble of the truck echoed down Dogwood Lane, a sound more comforting than any alarm clock. Donald sipped his coffee slowly, watching from his porch as the crew rolled to a gentle stop in front of each mailbox, then moved along with mechanical grace. Glenn joined him, pulling his hoodie closer against the morning breeze. They're early, Glenn noted. They're precise, Donald replied. There's a difference. At Trish's house, the bins remained untouched. Her curtains were drawn tight, and no lights showed through the windows. The once prominent HOA Command Center sign had been pulled from her shed door, leaving behind 4 screw holes and a faded rectangle of paint. Across the street, Troy stood beside the shed, a crowbar in hand and a stack of cracked plexiglass leaning against the wall. He nodded at Glenn without saying much. The embarrassment in his posture had shifted into something else, resolution, perhaps. Mid-morning, a group of neighbors gathered by the newly painted community bulletin board. Someone had tied a bouquet of azaleas to the post. A folding table stood nearby with a handwritten sign, coffee and cleanup, all welcome. Beverly ladled hot cider into paper cups, chatting easily with Corey, Mina, and Mr. Dennings, who was now in charge of repainting the lamp posts. Glenn helped rearrange folding chairs, while a few kids picked up stray wrappers with grabbers. Donald walked over, dressed in his neatly ironed checkered shirt, coffee mug in hand, retired, but still watching, gleaming faintly under the morning sun. Beverly waved him closer and handed him a stapled set of papers. Preliminary draft, she said. New HOA bylaws. Democratic, transparent, and absolutely no positions for life. Donald flipped through a few pages, nodding occasionally. Solid work. We'd like you to be our honorary advisor, she said. No pressure. I'm not running for anything. You wouldn't need to, she smiled. But your eyes catch what most miss. He didn't respond immediately, just folded the papers and tucked them under his arm. Let's get the lights working first. Then we'll talk policy. Around noon, a silver patrol car pulled into the cul-de-sac. Deputy Ross stepped out, his notepad tucked into his vest. "Morning, folks," he said. "Got an update." Everyone quieted. After initial review, there are indications of misappropriation. No criminal charges yet, still under review. For now, Ms. Moffat is suspended from all HOA-related activity and is to avoid direct contact with other residents pending inquiry. There were no cheers, just murmurs and a few exchanged glances. It wasn't vindication, but it was accountability. And that would do for now. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Glenn returned from a short walk and stopped at the mailbox. It hung slightly open. Frowning, he pulled it wider. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in black ink with no header or signature. Some rules were never meant to be broken. The Harding porch was quiet, until the wind nudged the mailbox open, and inside, the latest HOA draft returned. It fluttered gently, the folded papers brushing the edge of the tin door with a soft rustle. Donald reached over, plucked it out, and examined the familiar print. His name wasn't bolded or underlined. Just a simple return, no note, no comment. He exhaled through his nose, slid the document beneath the morning paper, and returned to his rocker. The porch groaned just slightly as he sat. Across the street, leaves from the magnolia tree drifted onto Tricia's porch. The house stood quiet, a for sale sign leaning slightly in the soft earth. Curtains still drawn. Nothing stirred, but occasionally, a sliver of movement flickered behind the fabric. The breeze, perhaps. Or perhaps not. The air was cooler now. Early October had brought a sleepy hush to Sweet Bay Falls. The mums in the Hardings' flower bed were in full bloom, gold, rust, and soft lavender, while the dogwoods had begun to shed their red-tinged leaves. Inside, Glenn stood at the kitchen counter, tapping the final lines of a blog post. The screen of his laptop glowed with the Sweet Bay SpeakUp interface, simple, clean, and recently updated with a Transparency Watch tab. New HOA leadership in progress, he read aloud. No dues collected until structural vote passed. Town hall scheduled for October 22nd. Anonymous comments now enabled. He hit publish, then sipped his coffee. Outside, Beverly arrived with a clipboard in one hand and a tote bag in the other. "Morning, boys," she called up the steps. "We've got 3 new households. I'm making rounds with voter registration and HOA orientation flyers. Thought I'd start with the ones who looked the most overwhelmed." "Check the cul-de-sac," Glenn replied. "They just moved in with 2 kids and a rabbit." She nodded. "Rabbits are promising. They ask fewer questions than HOA chairs." From down the path, a young woman waved. "Do we need new trash cans?" she asked Glenn. He smiled. "Nope. Just working security cameras." They laughed, but Glenn caught the meaning in Beverly's look, half amusement, half memory. The kind of glance only neighbors who've been through fire and back understand. By afternoon, the porch was sunny again. Donald had swept the walk and cleaned the porch railing. A few of the older residents were repainting mailboxes 2 streets over. Someone had planted daisies under the park sign. The bulletin board now had real contact numbers and a laminated phone tree. Still, there was no celebration. Just maintenance. Restoration. A quiet rhythm returning. Glenn sat beside his father, balancing a tablet on his knee. "They want to name you HOA Historian Emeritus," he said. Donald chuckled. "Just clean up your own curb. That's honor enough." He reached for his cup. The ceramic felt warm, familiar. "I renamed the Wi-Fi," Glenn added casually. Donald raised an eyebrow. "Watchtower _2.0. Donald gave a soft huff of laughter. "Not bad." As the sky dimmed into a soft blue haze, the street lights flicked on. Glenn set the tablet aside and leaned back. Silence fell between them, not heavy, not empty, just shared. At 2:34 a.m., the security camera by the mailbox flickered to life. A figure paused by the magnolia tree, just at the edge of its motion range, barely visible in the grainy feed. Then gone. Donald, half awake in his recliner, looked at the small monitor above the door. He watched it blink. Rewind. Play. A whisper of movement. The faintest outline. He didn't stand. He didn't call out. He just raised his cup and said softly, "Let them try." On a quiet street in Sweet Bay Falls, the trash was finally gone, but the lessons lingered longer than the scent of smoke or scandal. What began as a petty power grab turned into a community's quiet reckoning, led not by shouts or protests, but by documents, patience, and porchlight conversations. In neighborhoods across America, it's easy to ignore the small signs of misuse, until they touch your curb. Yet, as the residents of Sweet Bay learned, order doesn't come from fear, but from fairness. When rules are used for good, communities thrive. When they're misused, they crumble. And maybe, just maybe, it's time we all look out our windows, and keep watching.